right, moving on. Our next topic is development theory. And to guide us through this is Mr. Josh Carlson. He's the author of Space Power Ascendant, a unique book contrasting Chinese and American space theory and strategy, finding if China will win under the current strategy if it's not changed. He holds a master's degree in English and also a master's degree in military operational art and science, which is a mouthful, and is also the editor at Space Force Journal. His book, Space Power Ascendant, is extremely timely and relevant as China just planted its flag on the moon. Mr. Carlson, it's a pleasure to have you. Welcome to Blue Marble Week.
Thank you very much, Ed. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mike, for inviting me, for everyone else. I appreciate this chance to talk to you. And so here we go. Before I get started, just a quick disclaimer. This is my own personal capacity. My opinions expressed are my own and not necessarily reflect the view of the United States Army or Air Force, the Department of Defense, or the United States government. With that being said, let's begin. So we just talked about blue and brown. What's the importance of blue and brown in the strategic context? And the question I want to ask is, what is your theory of victory? And a theory of victory is where everything in the military starts. This will determine the strategy you use to win, and this is the way that will shape your means and ends. And this is very important because just one example from World War II, the British had a concept of victory in the air, that they were going to just turn German cities into rubble and to break the will of the populace. The Americans, we looked at targeting the industry of the Nazis and looked at it as a system that we could target specific bolts and nuts. And because of that different theory of victory, our strategies were distinctly different. The air campaign during World War II, and it turns out that targeting the specific nuts and bolts like the Americans did, specifically the oil and some of the other industrial things, completely changed the direction of the war. And so having a good theory of victory is absolutely essential. And so what is the theory of victory in context of blue and brown? Just basically, brown is a military theory of victory. Blue is more of a commercial theory of victory, if that makes sense. In brown water theory, it is all about the military. Blue water theory, it's much more looking at the commercial and the society as a whole. Why is this important? Let's talk about two visions of space power. And so on the top, obviously, this is the moon landings. This was going to the moon for the demonstration of superior technological capability, specifically. The bottom, if you get a chance to watch it, it's a great show, is The Expanse. The Expanse, it projects into the future. I don't remember if it says exactly the year, but I mean, we're talking several hundred years. There's a settlement on Mars, a pretty extensive settlement on Mars. There is a settlement on in the belt, several in the various asteroids and the moons of Jupiter. And this is a much more expansive view of space. These are the visions of space, kind of contrasting brown water and blue water. Brown water, you might go somewhere, but you're not really staying. Blue water, the intention is to go and expand. How does this relate? Well, we've talked a little bit about sea power and how that relates to space theory. There are obviously differences, but the naval expansions seem like they seem to be the closest parallels, because in the ocean, you're ultimately traveling through a area that humans cannot stop and inhabit for an extended period of time. You don't sit in the ocean. You go from point A to point B on the ocean with some intent in mind, which is how blue water theory envisions the moon, Mars, etc., islands in the celestial ocean, if you want to think of it that way. So everyone is familiar, or at least most people are familiar, with Christopher Columbus. That's the picture on the top, Nina Pina Santa Maria. 1492, sails across the Atlantic. At the time, the Europe was not a world power. It was embroiled in civil wars. It was threatened by exterior military and cultural threats, and it was struggling, quite honestly. The voyage in 1492, after the Spanish reconquered Spain, they sent this small detachment over in an effort to find a new trade route. Obviously, the rest is history. And so, but that so the initial exploration across the ocean led to the expansion, which was the various cities and other foundations of society that were put into the New World. And then that led to, particularly in the sense of the British and also the Spanish in different capacities, exploitation of the resources. This exploitation allowed for the bolstering of national power, saved several nations from bankruptcy. These nations were on the verge of bankruptcy. This new wealth that was flowing in from the New World allowed them not only to continue to exist, but to eventually become the world powers that by the 1700s, Europe basically was around the entire world. They had settlements all over the world by that point. What's really interesting is most people know that part of the story. Most people don't know the other half of the story, which is China. Right around 1500, they also had a fleet that's a replica of one of their ships. These were supposedly much bigger than the ships that Spain could boast at the time. They were larger, they were more capable. There is a settlement from Africa that is almost exclusively genetically Chinese, because there was a Chinese ship that they had navigated over to Africa, and the ship was wrecked and the sailors interbred with the local population. All of this to say that they had the capability. China definitely had the capability, or was on the cusp of it, of also perhaps circumnavigating the globe. But this is why the visions are so important. The theory of victory is so important. And while Spain was willing to send ships across the Atlantic to try to find a new trade route to expand their reach, China, the Navy Admiral Zhang, his successes were threatening, and the commerce that was coming in now from the outside was threatening the traditional hold-on power that the Chinese aristocracy had. And because of that, the Chinese aristocracy ended up destroying the fleet that was attempting to go out, either through outright burning or pulling the sailors off of the ships and allowing the ships to rot in dock. And the Chinese turned inward for about 200 years. Their theory of victory said, basically, we have everything we need right here. We don't need to expand. What did that lead to? Well, that vision, that theory of victory, brown versus blue, I would argue blue water above. This is a picture of England from about 1800. This is obviously bustling center of trade and power that is being able to be projected around the world. On the bottom, this is a picture of one of the sieges during the Opium Wars. China was able to keep its borders closed until European powers arrived, desiring trade. They used opium, which is obviously where we get modern heroin from, to open that trade, and eventually basically be able to execute whatever they wanted to inside the country, because they were able to beat them militarily, because they had all those resources that they were now drawing from around the globe to be able to project that power. And so what does this show us for space? I would argue that there's also two potential outcomes from the current race in space and the economic capabilities that space offers. I know Dr. Goswami has already talked about China to some extent. I believe she mentioned that there was a Martian exercise, essentially. This is actually, the top picture is from the Chinese Mars space camp, where they are basically, it's out in the red desert, so it even looks like Mars, and their whole goal is to train the next generation of Chinese youth to think about the fact that they want to have a colony on Mars, and that this is the vision of their country. At the same time, I would argue, and once again, very much my own opinion, I don't think that the United States has that similar strategic vision, that unifying goal to be able to reach out into space as a nation with the idea of the betterment of the globe, to be able to draw on those economic resources, those energy resources. I know Pete Gerritsen is very big on talking about space-based solar power. We talk about the green energy and the importance of all of that, all of the things that are rolled into that. And space-based solar power and other forms of energy would enable us to completely avoid or sidestep a lot of these negative things that have been predicted to be occurring in the near future. So what is this? Why is all this? How does all this relate to space development theory? All of this is related to space development theory because this is the background. This is the backdrop that this takes place of. Space development theory argues and makes the startling argument that space is just like every other domain, and if you want to expand into it, you must follow similar steps. That nations always expand in a similar fashion. How do they do that? First of all, they have some difference between military and civilian capabilities. There has not really been a delineation up to this point in space with that. Everything is generally under space power, and so there's some definition of space power that basically encompasses everything. In my argument, I don't think that that's a helpful non-delineation. That in every other domain, in sea we have maritime are those economic capabilities, and sea power the military. Likewise, in the air we have aviation is all of everything, and air power is a specifically military component. Likewise, in space, my theory proposes we should have astronautics as the elements that are majority commercial or industrial in nature, and are the elements that allow projection into production, sustainment, training, profit, and expansion in the domain. Space power is specifically military forces that can exert influence and from the domain or create effects in other domains. Having this delineation first helps to be able to talk about the context, and most of what is done outside of Space Force would generally fall into astronautics. Space Force, Space Command, that would be in general the space power that we are talking about. Now that we've talked about the fact that there's a difference between military and civilian things in every other domain, I would recommend that we have that similar delineation in space. How do you develop a new domain? Well, let's go back to real quick to the example that we had of the Nina Pinta Santa Maria. First of all, you have to have exploration. And I don't have an acronym like my friend Floyd did. I do have a alliteration, so that's almost the same thing. So the first E is exploration. What is there? How can I use it? And all of these are drawn out as entry criteria. So when you enter that phase, actions are things you do while you're in that phase, and exit is the exit criteria. At what point can you safely say, I am leaving this phase and going to the next one? So entry criteria for exploration is you have physical proximity to the location. You can go there. You are able to observe, map, and evaluate. If you can't get somewhere, you can't explore it. And so it'd be meaningless to talk about exploring the American continent when we had no capability to get there, for instance, if we were in Europe in 1491. But once you can go there, now you've entered the area of exploration. Your actions, you're identifying key locations. One big part of this is identifying both key strategic locations, so things that will potentially be very defensible or important to defend, and also identifying things that allow you to move more quickly and easily in the domain. So key locations would also be things like trade winds, the currents in the ocean, for instance, mountains, any number of things that could be key locations depending on what you're looking at. Resources, this would be everything from very fertile soil, that could be a resource if you are looking at potentially planting. If you're going to the moon, for instance, and you find some soil on the moon that for some reason is very arable and you can grow crops in it, and that's the only area on the moon, that now becomes a key resource that you have. Lunar ice would be a particular and large groupings of it, because you can melt that down into water, separate it, and you can use that to create rocket fuel, for instance. And so that would be a key resource that you would be looking at, particularly on the moon. And then phenomena impacting access and exploitation. So this is anything, this is kind of a bucket, anything else that that can speed or impinge on your ability to move, or return, because the theory of victory in space development theory is that you are going to this area to gain economic resources to bolster your economic capabilities so that you don't have to fight a war. You don't have to fight a military conflict. I really like the part of Nami's brief when the Chinese said that war is the breakdown of strategy, not the goal of it. And so that is very much in keeping also with space development theory. It is very much a Sun Tzu look at theory in space. If I have to go fight you, I have failed in my strategy, because I should never have to if I follow this strategy properly. So I'm there. I now know what's there. I've mapped it. By the way, mapping is very interesting. Ideologically, mapping claims ownership. It gives a name to something that had no name before. And incidentally, the Chinese name their things in Chinese, which means that now everything they discover has a Chinese name, which is a way that they are claiming initial ownership and forcing the world to use their language, their nomenclature for referring to things. Ideationally, that's fairly important. Expansion. So expansion is now that we know what's there. So once again, I know I'm flipping back and forth between lenses. I'm trying to make sure I can draw this together so it's understood in history and then what this looks like potentially in space. In history, we're on the Santa Maria. We've gone to the New World. We've explored. We know what's there. Now it's able to sustain presence. We are expanding to this new area. We are getting infrastructure. We are putting in infrastructure. We are putting in permanent facilities and communications and logistics capabilities. So entry, once I can sustain a presence, I have entered the expansion phase. In our current space environment, I would argue that we are probably in the exploitation. We'll get to that later, but we're definitely past the expansion, because we can maintain a presence in Leo, Meo, Hio, Geo. The orbits around Earth, we can largely sustain a presence there, even a human presence. The International Space Station has been in orbit for decades at this point. And so but that's the next step, is expanding once you can sustain presence. And I highlight either permanent or rotational. So you can expand to an area, even if it's not the same people there, but as long as you can rotate and keep people there, you've expanded. Your goal is to establish logistics, observation, communication, outposts, ports, living areas, basically everything that allows you to be there permanently and lower the cost of getting there. That's what you're trying to do in expansion. And I would argue this can be either military or economic. An economic expansion would be something kind of like the 49ers with the gold rush in California, where people just rushed across the middle of the country to get over to California, where there was gold coming out of every stream you could find. And a military expansion looks much more like some of the more measured expansions right after Lewis and Clark. Lewis and Clark would be exploration. Fort Huachuca in Arizona, interesting bit of history, it was founded to guard a local spring, because that was the only source of water in that area, and it ran along a major route going east-west for settlers going west. That was a military expansion, a military force being used to hold once again a key resource of the only water in the area, to make sure that they had access for the people going through. They were making it easier to move along that line of effort. And for exiting expansion, the area in question, logistics, they're secure enough to begin exploitation. This means exploitation is almost always economically and commercially driven. And so it has to be safe enough from threats that you're not getting all your convoys raided or pirated. It has to be important enough that they're willing to go there, that they'll make money. And it has to be as low of cost as possible so that more people can enter that marketplace. And for exploration and expansion, both of these are net negatives to national power. And that means that it is costing us money to do these, usually. Not very much necessarily, but it's costing us money. We are not benefiting from this yet. Exploitation is where that flips. And now we are actually gaining benefit economically. We have a net positive of economic gain from that area. And so exploitation is when I start getting stuff back. And so the entry is that the gain is high enough, risk is low enough, commercial interests are willing to gather, produce, and distribute along these resources, whatever they are. Looking historically, this is where you had the trappers going over to the New World, and the gain was high enough, the risk was relatively low enough. They were willing to go and start trying to catch furs that were very expensive to bring back to Europe, and so they could make a lot of money doing that very quickly. And that was kind of like the French model. Spanish model was grab gold and bring it back. That didn't work out so well, and so I don't think that that's a particularly good model to do. The British, I think, actually had one of the best ones, and this is one of the reasons I default slightly to a British model for this, is they would set up whole cities, when they expanded, they brought whole cities to these new areas and generated whole new markets, as opposed to just trying to bring resources back to Europe and keeping the market constant. They grew the market itself to gain that economic benefit through taxes. The exiting criteria for this is that the resource is exhausted, or hostile forces can project sufficient force to cause supposition, or if promotion, then it is considered a key national interest, and that's where you also get into exclusion. In general, every nation wants to get and stay in the exploitation phase. If they can gain a net benefit, and this expands to, in my opinion, this expands to everything. So whether that is, we are looking at America in 18X, and they're expanding sea to shining sea, they followed this exact process and eventually trying to get exploitation so that they could get economic gain from all this new land that we were gaining and then we look at the space, looking at potentially going to the moon, setting up moon colonies. I think at some point, I mean, SpaceX is talking about setting up a Mars colony, and they're also going to have to follow a fairly similar stepped process, because you're not going to be able to, you don't want to just expand. The whole point is you don't want to land on the wrong spot on Mars, for instance, and you don't have any water, but there's water, 20 miles over that way, but you don't have any way to get there, or a limited way to get there. But if you just founded your colony over there, you could have saved that whole problem. That's why these steps are in the area they are. The exclusion step is the only conditional step. And I know I'm getting low on time here, so I'll try to accelerate as much as I can. Exclusion step is the only conditional step, and it is only when there is contested control, generally by hostile powers. And it is important, and the area itself is important enough that the national body is willing to fight over it. And so the actions in exclusion can be either offensive or defensive, either aiming to eliminate hostile occupation or prevent hostile occupation. So what this would be, so for instance, the French and Indian War, it's called in the Americas, was the war right before the war of 1776, the American Revolution. This was a war actually fought between the French and their Indian allies and the British and their American colonists. And George Washington was in this battle at Fort Ticonderoga. And as an example of the French were to the west of the American colonies, and as the American colonies were pushing further and further west away from the seaboard, this was starting to encroach on the land that the French and the Indians considered their own. And so in an effort to stop this encroachment, they went to war with the British and the Americans. The Americans and British ended up eventually winning this, but this would be an example of an exclusion phase being entered. Both forces, both of the French and the British and their various allies, were attempting to exclude the enemy from a particular area that was contested. And the phase was only ended once the contested control was eliminated by one party or the other. In this particular case, it was through peace treaty. But in theory, it could have gone to the point where either party would have been more roundly defeated. Probably not, though, as this is usually a trading of pieces. Or another historical example would be the Great Game from the 1800s. England, by that point, they were at the top of their game, and they control. The sun never sets on the British Empire, right? That was their whole motto. And so India in particular was considered their crown jewel. The Russians, however, were trying to project force down into India, and so the English fought a game in Afghanistan for a number of decades to try to prevent that Russian encroachment, for example. In this particular space context, in an exclusion phase, you would be looking at potentially, it would almost certainly be military in some way, shape, form, or fashion. But the other capabilities of national power are also going to be leveraged, as Mike already pointed out, the dime model. So diplomatically, you're going to be trying to destroy the enemy's narrative for why they have legitimacy and gain allies to say that, yes, we agree that they don't have legitimacy. Informational is very similar, but also projecting propaganda for one side or the other. And then economically, you're probably going to be targeting their economic capabilities that they might be gaining from this to reduce the benefit they gain, or to reduce overall economic benefit to them so that they can't fuel their military if it's going to be an extended fight. So these are the phases of space development as outlined in space development theory. And this is just a pictorial example of what this kind of looks like if you put it over a timeline. And let me see, it's been a while since I've done geometry. The x-axis is time, y-axis, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, we'll go with it. Y-axis is economic benefit. So going up is economic benefit, side to side is time. So over time, economic benefit continues to accrue until you get to the exploitation phase. And then notice it dips at exclusion. And that's because it costs money. They might not be getting a net benefit because they have to expend additional military or other resources to maintain that area. And then this just breaks this out in more detail. Talking specifically about each instrument of national power. We're a little short on time, so I won't get into each of these in detail. You'll forgive me. I'll give this briefing to Mike, and he can cover it, or he can send that out. But what's at stake is ultimately, in my opinion, the real takeaway. What's the theory of victory? What's at stake? And General Quast, retired now, quite honestly said that space is the Navy of the 21st century economy. And then skipping down to the quote, whoever gets to the new market sets the values for that market. And we could either have that market with the values of our Constitution, or we could have the values we see manifest in China. And Dr. Goswami already talked about that China has essentially a first come, first serve mentality. And that if they own it, it's theirs. And so I think that allowing China to set up moon, space, and other norms first is very dangerous, if not completely detrimental to American interests.
Thank you, Josh. That was terrific. You've got, I posted a link to your book in the chat. And then immediately, I'm not sure who Brian Reed is, but the very next thing is an excellent book, a must read, regardless whether or not one's interested in military aspects of national policy. So there's two endorsements, mine and Brian's.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that. We don't actually have a lot of time to get into questions, but it is really worth digging into this conversation. How we figure out, what'd you call it? The victory conditions?
What is your theory of victory? What is your strategic goal? Yes.
You know, I wish we had time to kind of dig into that a lot more. So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Josh. I'm going to turn it over to Ed. See ya.
Yes, thank you very much.